The biggest pleasure I get from motorcycling is touring. Yes, I enjoy local solo rides and my advanced riding club activities in a training capacity or socially on group rides. But the greatest satisfaction for me of motorcycling is the ability to undertake longer distance trips and to enjoy the sensations associated with motorcycling in some areas of outstanding beauty. I've had many enjoyable trips both within the UK and overseas in mainland Europe, short or long weekends, and trips which have lasted several days. What would make these touring activities even more enjoyable though, would be to undertake them on an electric motorcycle. But to do those kinds of journeys in any realistic time frame is going to require rapid charging capabilities, and this luxury remains almost wholly within the domain of electric cars and not electric motorcycles. There are, however, a couple of notable commercially available DC rapid charging electric motorcycle brands on the market in the UK and elsewhere around the world: the Harley-Davidson Livewire and the Energica range of bikes. You may have seen my experience riding an Energica Eva Ribelle electric motorbike back in August and gathered that I thought it was worthy of a suitable challenge to prove its suitability, or indeed unsuitability, as a touring motorcycle. Well, what would make a suitable challenge to establish whether an electric motorcycle could work as a realistic touring machine? Easy. Ride it from the most easterly point in the country to the most westerly point in one journey. A journey of approximately 450 miles, or 724 kilometres. I concede, having looked over historic GPS logs of past motorcycle trips, that this kind of distance in a day is rare. It's the exception rather than the norm. In my experience, most historic daily mileage on touring trips is between 150 to 250 miles. That's 240 to 400 kilometres. And those generally fill the day when you consider that they aren't typically undertaken on long sections of motorways, but on mountain roads or other similarly twisty stretches. Now, as daunting a trip as that may sound to some, there are a few fellow electric bikers out there who enjoy the longer rides. One of them is the excellent Sam Baker, based in New Zealand, who has a common background with Zero motorcycles. But Sam owned for some time an older model Energica Ego with the smaller battery capacity, and he managed to ride from the bottom to the top of New Zealand's North Island on a mission to buy Taco Bell food. If you don't already, take a look at Sam's channel. He creates great content and it's always entertaining and informative. And as I was putting together this video, US Energica Eva Ribelle owner Stephen Day, aka Zero Fun on YouTube, completed his third crossing of the US this year on his bike, riding a whopping 800 miles or 1,300 kilometres a day, and set the new record for the fastest electric motorcycle crossing of the US, doing so in 93 hours. Not forgetting yours truly, of course. I still have fond memories of my own challenge back in 2017 to become the first to ride an electric motorcycle from Land's End to John O'Groats, then proceeding on to score at the top of Shetland via Orkney, all before I had the charge tank fitted to my Zero DSR to improve charging speeds. But back to the task at hand. I'm interested in finding out the true capabilities of a rapid charging motorbike, and there is no better way of appreciating these without trying things for yourself. Fortunately, the team at Energica UK and the English Electric Motor Company were happy for me to conduct this test, and so what you're looking at here is a rather wind and rain swept me at 7:30 in the morning on Saturday the 30th of October at Ness Point on the seafront at Lowestoft, the furthest point east, not just in England or even Great Britain, but in the whole of the British Isles. I'd collected the bike the previous afternoon from the English Electric Motor Company in Diss and ridden the 34 miles, or 54 kilometres, to Lowestoft on the Suffolk coast. I'd planned an overnight stop at a bed and breakfast in Lowestoft, just a mile or so from Ness Point, so I was ready to start at a reasonable time the following morning. To put myself at ease, on arriving in Lowestoft, I headed to an Osprey charge point in the North Quay Retail Park, and put the bike on a CCS rapid charge there to ensure that everything worked okay. Initially it seemed to, and the bike looked like it was charging for a couple of minutes. Then it inexplicably stopped. Never mind, these things happen. I reinitiated a charge session, but got the same result once again. Fortunately, there were a couple more rapid chargers on the other side of a nearby roundabout, situated in a Bannatyne's health club. I gave the first Instavolt unit a go. The session appeared to start, but then quickly stopped again. I tried a couple more times before putting it down to an unusually unlikely issue, a faulty Instavolt point, and so I tried the second unit. Still the same problem. At this point I could see that the issue might not be with the units, but the bike. I could see what appeared to be the problem, but determined to call it a day and head to the bed and breakfast, where the kind owners let me plug the bike in and AC charge it, which went perfectly well. I messaged Alec at English Electric Motor Company and informed him of the issue and of my plan in the morning to ride to a charge point on my planned route and to try to charge again. If at that point I still had the same problem, I'd be close enough to Dis, almost directly south of it, to ride back and potentially abandon the trip. But Alec was already coming up with a plan B and stated that we might have to put me on a different bike. A little bit downhearted, I turned in. Was the journey over before it had even properly started? The following morning I was up and out at 7 and made it to Nest Point for 7:30. The weather was poor, but when the weather is bad it's just a case of decent clothing. And as good as the laminated Gore-Tex kit I have is at keeping me dry, when the day starts off that bad, I just put waterproofs over the top as a first line of defence, but also because it's far easier if they get wet to dry them out properly, and better than my normal kit getting filthy from road spray. So, after a brief inaudible talk to camera, I headed off. My initial plan was to head on a route skirting London on the M25, and then cross-country past Reading and Salisbury. Given the issues I'd had, I planned a first stop at a Shell garage in Woodbridge, 40 miles or 64 kilometres from Lowestoft. But I encountered the same issues I'd encountered the previous evening. This time I had the presence of mind to video what was happening so I could relay the issue to Alec. I phoned him and told him I'd bring the bike back, then rode the bike back northwards the 30 miles or 48 kilometres to Dis. Alec and the team at EEMC couldn't have been more accommodating. Alec was clearly as keen as I was for me to be on my way with a properly functioning bike. After a brief discussion in which he said that he himself had seen a similar issue before and believed a software update was required, we swapped the luggage over and I was off on the Eva Ribelle RS with an Italian registration plate. The bike having just come in from a press review, Alec was confident it would be fine. Nevertheless, it needed a quick top-up, and, as I quickly discovered, it needed some air in the front tyre. So I headed briefly back east to a BP garage to rapid charge, and, despite my reservations and experience with BP Polar charge points, much to my relief, it worked just fine. As an aside, the bike's clock was an hour ahead, presumably still on Italian time, but I didn't bother to change it until later in the day, because in the early hours of the following morning we'd be going back in time anyway, from British Summer Time to Greenwich Mean Time, or Coordinated Universal Time. The bike charged from 55 to 87% in 24 minutes, whilst I dealt with a couple of calls and looked at a revised route, and then, around 4 hours behind my original schedule, a mere 32 miles away from the start point, and off my originally planned route, I headed off. The revised route proposed by a better route planner took me on a route almost directly westwards, before dropping me ultimately on the M5 motorway. This in fact meant I would be travelling in familiar areas around North Oxfordshire and into Gloucestershire. But I wasn't going to argue with a better route planner. By this stage I was more concerned about making up lost time in whatever way I could, and if that meant more motorway miles, so be it. If anything, that would potentially make it more of a challenge for the bike in terms of operating temperature, as I intended to ride it without compromise. The next rapid charging stop was going to be on the outskirts of Cambridge at a McDonald's, resplendent with a couple of Instavolt charge points. But they were both in use and someone else was waiting to charge too when I turned up. After waiting around 15 minutes on the off chance that diners might emerge and depart, I decided to press on to Biggleswade, where I could see there was a pod point rapid charger at an Aldi. I arrived at 2:16, charged from 13 to 84% while I grabbed a bite to eat and drink, and was on my way at 2:58. My next stop was at another Bannatynes Health Club, this time very much in known territory in Banbury, a mere hour's ride from my home. I've got a long way to go, and a short time to get there. No, it's not Smoking the Bandit. The weather fortunately has turned a lot better, because it started out horrendous again this morning, as you will have seen. Yeah, and it's been sunny pretty much since I got out of the Suffolk area, really. It brightened up. So, but I'm not taking this stuff off, because soon, other bikers will know, as soon as you take waterproof stuff off, you guarantee it's going to rain again. And I've got, like I say, I've got a long way to go. It's going to be pretty much motorways for much of it now. Anyway, that's enough chatting. I'm going to have a quick thing to drink and get myself sorted out. I arrived at 4:24 with 33% battery remaining and charged to 89%, leaving at 5:05. The following stint took me through very familiar country, across the Cotswolds on some very nice roads, down through Stow-on-the-Wold and down to Gloucester, where I finally picked up the M5 motorway. Now on a motorway, I decided to really put the bike to the test by putting it into cruise control mode and riding at the maximum speed on a motorway of 70 miles per hour. I had no intention of treating the bike any differently from how I'd ride a petrol bike, so I could properly gauge its touring suitability. As it transpired, it seemed to be taking things in its stride. I had noticed the battery temperature indicator move from green to yellow while charging, indicating a moderately warm battery, but once on the motorway it actually reverted to green. Indeed, I was quite impressed to see that riding the bike at the maximum legal road speed in the UK apparently actually helped to cool it down. 5:31 saw my arrival at Michaelwood services on the M5 and to a vehicle charging on the only available CCS charge point, an old Ecotricity electric highway unit. Naturally, the car remained there for quite some time. The upshot was I spent a protracted hour and 15 minutes or so stuck at the services as the day faded to night, until I left at 6:47, having charged from 30 to 90%. During my time there, the downpours had started again, and I was actually glad to be out of the worst of it. From Michaelwood, it was another 70 mile per hour leg down the motorway to Taunton, where I arrived at 7:55 at a newer GridServe unit to a Jaguar I-Pace driver who was clearly somewhat frustrated at the unit for not charging his car. He consented to let me try on the same point to establish whether the problem might be his car or the charge point. To my pleasure, at least, it worked fine on the Energica, and I charged while we chatted and another car turned up to use the point. I arrived on 23%, but neglected to record the departing battery level. I left Taunton at 8:39 and then, continuing down the M5, arrived in Exeter at 9:10. I had an initial issue starting a charge on one of the new GridServe charge points there, but it did succeed on my second attempt. The other 2 points were in use. I took the charge from 48 to 95% there, and as will soon become apparent, it was no bad thing that I charged to 95%. It was still putting in 16 kilowatts at 85%, and the battery temperature indicator remained green. I departed Exeter at 23 minutes past 10. Still with some way to go, I was now leaving the M5 motorway for the long haul down the A30 through Devon and into Cornwall, clipping Dartmoor and crossing Bodmin Moor. Much of that stretch of A30, although dual carriageway, is unlit, and so I got to see the headlights working very well with a nice clean white light in both dipped and full beams. Quite different from the stock and frankly poor headlight on my Zero DSR. I passed Cornwall services at about 10 to midnight. Seeing the sign for Victoria services, I didn't recognise the name and dismissed it. But if I had known it for certain to have been the Cornwall services we used a few years ago with our Nissan Leaf, I might have gone in there, in the full expectation that the charge point wouldn't work, it being one of the old Ecotricity units, and not yet upgraded to one of the GridServe points. In hindsight, this was a bad move. At a minute before midnight, I arrived with 15% battery remaining at Kingsley Village in Penhale, at what looked like a nice modern Shell garage with 2 very new Shell recharge charge points, a well-lit area with a McDonald's on site. Looking at the Zap Map app, I could see that one of the points had been reported as having a fault by a previous user, and one as working fine. I don't hold too much credence by these reports, however, since a failed charge could be down to an individual vehicle. Sure, if there are multiple failures reported, that suggests a charge point issue, but an individual failure around multiple successes can be misleading. However, on this occasion, the first point didn't indeed work, and neither did the second. 15 minutes later, having established that there was another rapid charger Shell garage 5 miles away, I headed off. Arriving at the Carland Cross Shell garage at 25 minutes past midnight with 14% battery remaining. Yes, I did take those 5 miles very carefully. I tried again several attempts to get a charge working, but it simply wasn't happening. I tried the helpline, and after a few more attempts, the helpful chap on the help desk suggested I try at least an AC charge while considering what to do next. I could call him back and he would stop the charge remotely when I was ready to leave. I took him up on the offer whilst I looked at my options. I could see that there was a business unit a further 8 miles away with a charge point which appeared to have good feedback, albeit in a location without any amenities. Eventually I called back the helpline chap and we stopped the session. At this point, the charge session having been terminated, I struggled to disconnect the AC cable. Expressing my concern to the help desk guy, he quite rightly said that every vehicle must have an emergency release method, and recalling that there is indeed a metal tab next to the charge port, I lifted this, only for the metal tab to lift completely out. Great. Fortunately, I managed to relocate the metal release tag back in position and it seemed to be fine. Trying the AC cable again with a bit more force, it detached easily enough. It was 1:24 by the time I left the garage and was on my way again, limping the 8 miles to the Trevisum Business Park in Blackwater and arriving with 11% at 140. Again, I took it very easy. But once again, the gods were against me, and after a couple of attempts to initiate a charge, I tried the Genie Point helpline. After negotiating the initial automated menus, I got the ringtone for the help desk, followed swiftly by the sound of someone answering and then appearing to hang up. That's annoying, I thought, and tried once again, only to get the same result. Now I was pretty peeved. The last 4 attempts to rapid charge had failed for one reason or another, when I had made it all the way across the country, successfully charging each time until I reached Cornwall. My final hope was another Genie Point charge point in the middle of the nearby town of Redruth, 6 miles away. I resigned myself to the possibility that I might fail to complete the trip to Land's End in one go, let down by charging infrastructure. But at least if I was in town, there might be options to charge on AC, or even get recovery or an alternative bed for what remained of the rest of the night. As I rode from Blackwater to Redruth, I saw my phone clock move from British summertime back an hour to GMT. But the notion of gaining an extra hour's sleep seemed pretty insignificant. I arrived, like a Time Lord, in the Flowerpot Chapel car park at 1:15. It started to rain again, and the screen on the charge point, displaying a smug animation of a green car but no text of any kind, somehow seemed to mock me. I pressed on different areas of the screen helplessly, to no avail. Resigned to almost certain failure, I gave the helpline, which had already hung up on me twice at the last location, a call, and to my surprise, a woman answered the call. I explained the situation and she offered to reboot the unit and start the charge remotely, which she duly did. It was genuinely one of those moments of pure relief as I saw the battery percentage creep up on the bike from 5 to 6 to 7%, and I made sure she knew how much of a hero she was. By the time I had 50% battery capacity, I had more than enough to make the 28 miles or 45 kilometres to my destination. She'd instructed me to simply press the emergency stop button and reset it when I was done, so this I did. Finally, at 1:44, or 2:44 as far as my body clock was concerned, I headed off from Redruth for the last few miles of the journey. But during my time in Redruth, the weather had taken a further turn for the worse. As I rode the last few miles down to Penzance and on to Land's End, the wind picked up greatly and the rain fell harder. I had to negotiate strewn leaves, twigs and floods on the dark section of the A30 between Penzance and Land's End. But eventually I made it to the Land's End Visitor Centre and official finish line at 2:37. I briefly considered riding down to the signpost behind the centre, but decided against it. I didn't fancy being exposed to the weather coming off the sea behind the building, given how bad it was in front of it. The signpost could wait until the daylight and hopefully better weather. I had a bed to get to. Fortunately, my B&B was less than a mile away. A favourite location, having stayed there before, the Land's End Hostel and B&B is a great location for access to Land's End. Clearly set up in part for end-to-enders, the B&B room offers a little more comfort than the standard hostel. I had phoned earlier on in the day and explained the situation. They were fortunately more than understanding and explained where I could find the key and that I could put the bike in the summer house and charge it overnight. I didn't even need to consider leaving the place by the normal checkout time of 10 o'clock, but could sleep in if I wanted. I really appreciated that, even if I had no intention of leaving it too late to set off. As I pulled up in the wretched weather, I could see the welcome of a bedside table light in the room I was staying in, and it was a very welcome sight. I took the bike around to the courtyard and quickly realised there had been a breakdown in communication over the kind of electric bike it was. There was no way the Energica was going to be getting into the summer house. It didn't matter. The area was covered by security lights and cameras, secluded and well sheltered from the elements. I allowed myself a chuckle, disc-locked the bike and headed for a welcome shower and bed, finally turning in just after 3 o'clock. The next attempt to charge could wait until the morning down at the rapid charger at the Land's End Visitor Centre. For now, I needed sleep. The following morning, or more accurately a few short hours later, I awoke to much better weather. Fortunately, the fierce winds and rain had moved on. After tucking into a bit of light self-service breakfast in my room, I gathered my things together, put the panniers back on the bike and donned my waterproofs again. While the weather had improved, I had another reasonably long day ahead. I met up with new B&B owner Nico in the B&B's courtyard and thanked him for his understanding. We had a conversation about the bike and I explained what I was doing. We then briefly discussed charging options and he mentioned that they were considering installing an EV charge point. So I made a couple of recommendations, then said goodbye and headed the short distance to the Land's End Visitor Centre. A friend of mine has quipped that I should probably look at getting somewhere to live in the area now. And I must admit, having visited the place once as a child in the mid-1970s and then not returned for decades, it does seem like I have been back a few times over the last decade. Arriving at 10:35, I drew up to the new GridServe rapid charge point. Historically, there were old Ecotricity electric highway rapid chargers at both Land's End and John O'Groats, but as with the older units, these could be prone to issues with reliability. I was hoping that I'd encounter no such problems this morning, and was pleased to see the new unit. With the battery at 21%, I didn't want a repeat of last night's shenanigans. To my relief, the bike charge initialised just fine. I hadn't actually given backup plans a thought, although I knew there was another rapid charger around 10 miles or 16 kilometres away in Penzance. I was already thinking that the main challenge was behind me now, and contented myself that I was splitting the return journey into 2 hopefully less frantic days of enjoying the ride. So I took the time to take in the sea view and quickly visit the famous signpost. Just after 11 o'clock, I went to see how the charge was progressing, and was pleased to see it had reached 93%. So I headed off. The day's plan was to ride more or less along the south coast and make Worthing, just west of Brighton, by day's end. But the first section of the journey saw me retrace my steps from the previous night, back up the A30 towards Exeter. I'd already grown accustomed by this point to having rapid charging available on a motorbike, but I did have to remind myself that charging from 20 to 90% in 30 minutes was not something I was used to on my own electric motorbike. It's not unusual for electric cars to charge at rates of 150 to 200 kilowatts and beyond, but I did reflect how truly transformational true rapid charging is to an electric motorcycle. 24 kilowatts may seem a low charge rate to electric car owners, but when you're dealing with around 18 kilowatt hour usable battery capacity, 24 kilowatts is just great. As I headed back up the now fully dry A30, I decided to call in again at the Shell garage I'd first encountered a problem at the previous night, and was encouraged at least to see 2 vehicles charging there. Unfortunately, I followed an electric car in, which it transpired was also planning to charge there. It transpired that a Jaguar I-Pace owner was struggling to charge at the first charge point, and so he abandoned it after a while. I likewise had no success. In the interim, however, I finally got onto the second point, and after a couple of unsuccessful attempts, got the bike charging. However, this success was short-lived, and the bike took on a measly 5% before the charge session stopped. By this stage, I'd spent an hour there, so abandoned it again and decided this time to try Cornwall services, a short distance away. Much to my surprise, the old Ecotricity unit at Cornwall services sprang into life and started charging the bike without any problem, and to add insult to injury, it worked first time and was on free vend, so the charge stop costed me absolutely nothing. I swore at myself. If I'd only taken the decision to go back to the services the previous night, I would have saved myself all the hassle I had, and would have probably arrived 2 hours earlier than I did. But hindsight's a wonderful thing. I genuinely expected the old Ecotricity unit not to work. I had charged our MG ZS EV without any problem at Shell charge points before, and at that stage the previous night, having got all the way across the country and charged 6 times in a row without any problem, why would I turn around and go in the opposite direction to find a charge point which probably didn't work when a new shiny Shell recharge point was just a little further ahead? Having taken the bike to just over 90% and played my now familiar favourite response to those approaching me with the Italian registered bike, inquiring as to whether I spoke any English with a broad Yorkshire "aye, a little," followed by some genuinely enthusiastic conversations, I headed towards my next stop back at Exeter Services. I arrived with 26% and charging there once again went just fine. Whilst charging, I had a couple of enjoyable conversations, one with a fellow bike owner and 2013 Nissan Leaf owner, and another with a more elderly couple who were keen to hear more about the bike. The next leg of the journey was going to comprise some standard A roads, so I was looking forward to it. And because I've done a lot of talking up until now, I'll take a break and put the natural sound on. You can make out the characteristic whine of the electric motor in between the wind noise. Enjoy the ride! "76 miles, or 122 kilometres later, and with 33% battery remaining, I pulled into a Starbucks with a couple of Instavolt charge points. But once again I encountered charging problems and couldn't quite figure out why. So instead I tried a Genie point charger at a nearby Esso garage. This time, after another unsuccessful attempt, I had the idea of manually closing the locking pin by lifting the manual override, and this time it worked. Could it be that the problem I had encountered at some points was down to the chargers in question being fussy about whether the plug was properly locked in place? Could a locked pin, even manually engaged, somehow be required in the complex communications between the bike and the charge point? I couldn't really be sure, but that certainly appeared to be the case. At my final charge stop of the day at the Antelope Retail Park in Southampton, I encountered some of the latest Instavolt charge points and tried the recommended plug-in and charge sequence. It didn't work, so I lifted the manual override tab to engage the pin and tried again. This time it worked. It certainly appeared that I had found a solution to the problem. I rode the remainder of the journey mostly on dual carriageways, in another downpour, but I was content that I had seemingly found a workaround should I encounter any similar charging issues the following day, and arrived at the bed and breakfast in Worthing just after 9 o'clock. The following morning I awoke once again to a bright sunny day in a beautiful countryside setting. On telling the owner the previous evening that I preferred a light breakfast, he laughed and said the chef was ex-army and, quote, a bit of a feeder, and that he wouldn't let me go without being properly fed. He wasn't wrong, and in the event I didn't need to eat for the rest of the day. Having been fed, I collected the bike from one of the farm buildings where it had been charged to 100% overnight and set off at 10 o'clock. The forecast was good, so I stashed the waterproofs in the panniers. From the Old Selden Farm bed and breakfast, I initially continued from West Sussex to the outskirts of nearby Brighton in East Sussex and then headed northwards. I took the road around Lewes past the famous chalk rock face and recognised a nearby house from an episode of the house building show Grand Designs. I had decided to route via Tunbridge in Kent, not to be confused with nearby Tunbridge Wells. There were two reasons for this. One, because I once again wanted to enjoy the first part of the journey on standard A roads and explore a little, but also because I have an ancestral connection with Tunbridge, as generations of my paternal family lived there. Arriving in Tunbridge, I headed to the Cannon Lane Retail Park, where I arrived at 11:30 at an Osprey charge point, with 54% battery remaining, having travelled 57 miles, or 91 kilometres, since leaving the bed and breakfast 90 minutes beforehand. This time I preempted any charge pin issues by manually engaging the pin before the charge session started, and it started without problem. I enjoyed a couple of conversations, one with a local biker who had not seen an electric motorcycle, and another with a local retired couple who were very interested in the bike. Tearing myself away from the engaging conversation, I stopped the charge session at 97% at 12:19 and decided to visit 3 places quickly in the town with ancestral connections. Firstly, I headed to the nearby church of St Peter and Paul's, where my paternal great-great-great-grandfather and namesake is buried, albeit in an unmarked grave. Having grown up in Yorkshire in northern England to parents from London, we had visited family and friends in the London area when I was younger, but the Tunbridge connection went back much further, and it's not a place I know, having only visited briefly once before about 10 years ago. From there, I went to a couple of locations in the town I knew my ancestors had lived from my own genealogical research. One near the castle, which it transpired no longer had the property my ancestors would have lived in, and another on a nearby road. So, not altogether a purposeful genealogical visit, but it was nice to think that I was in an area which former generations of family members knew as home. Tunbridge was my penultimate charge stop, and from there it was going to be predominantly dual carriageways and motorway back to Diss. I took the A21 passing Sevenoaks, then the M25 to get around London via the Dartford crossing, and headed back across East Anglia via Essex towards Suffolk on the A12. I did stop briefly at a BP Polar charge point at Boreham service area in Springfield, but I had issues with that unit accepting payments, so proceeded to Capel St Mary near Ipswich and finished my final charge at a rather unassuming and forlorn looking old Ecotricity electric highway point. The irony wasn't lost on me that these once notoriously unreliable old charge points had been the bane of many people's journeys, but on my trip with the Energica, they had worked on every occasion, contrary to my own expectations. I charged from 20%, but neglected to record the departing battery level. Once more, I engaged with someone in conversation about the bike, but then had to make my excuses. Time was pressing on, and I needed to get the bike back to English Electric Motor Company. I really tried to relish the remainder of the journey and reflect on my experiences over the long weekend. These were the right kinds of roads once more to enjoy the riding to its maximum. Some nice sweeping bends and lovely surrounding countryside, set against a backdrop of an autumnal sunset. So, in reviewing the trip, what have I gleaned? Firstly, what had I found most challenging? That was easy to answer. The experience with charging infrastructure. To an extent, that sums up my now 8 years of electric vehicle ownership. Things have improved greatly from the days when I first took ownership of a Nissan Leaf in 2014. There is some level of redundancy now in many areas of the country where once there was none, but this still needs to improve. Ultimately, we need to reach the stage where electric vehicle charging stations are as common as fuel stations are today, and where each charging station has as many rapid charging points as they do fuel pumps today. My experience with the unreliable charging infrastructure in Cornwall demonstrated this clearly. Then again, were all these issues down to the charge points? Apparently not. There was clearly an issue with the charge plug locking pin mechanism on the particular bike I was riding, and there had been an issue with the charging of the initial bike, so I can't say the bikes worked flawlessly. Nevertheless, I know of Energica owners who haven't experienced these issues, and Stephen Day's successful epic trip across the USA in 93 hours, even allowing for a puncture, speaks volumes in itself. Sam Baker of New Zero Land reported no such issues with his Energica Ego, and fellow Brit and former Zero owner Aaron Cocker, who recently took ownership of an Energica SSN9, has also not experienced these issues, although he did mention in conversation that he had seen an error about the locking pin. In fact, Alec at EEMC had advised me of this message and mentioned that I could ignore it. It seems then that there are some improvements to be made in this mechanism, and I don't know whether it's ultimately a software or hardware issue, or to what extent this may affect communications between the bike and charge point. CCS is a complex charging protocol by all accounts. Any other gripes? 2 others that I can think of. Firstly, the cruise control button is too far over to the left to engage it comfortably from the right hand grip. I found myself reaching over with my left hand on more than one occasion to engage it. I'm not sure what the thinking was behind this, but it honestly could and should be brought closer so that it is easily reachable by the right hand's thumb. Otherwise, it would be good to see options for hard luggage. Personally, I've come around to the idea of soft luggage in recent years, but there is clearly a demand from Energica owners for hard luggage and a wing rack, with a Dutch company producing bespoke racks to enable this. But clearly, the Energica range of bikes can tour. The issues I had expected I might encounter on a single journey of almost 500 miles, riding the bike without making any allowances for the power chain and at the maximum speed limit, did not arise at all. Not only that, the bike had actually cooled down once back on the road, while riding at the speed limit on the fastest roads in the country. Liquid cooling for the win, as we might say. The simple fact is that to do these kind of journeys in these kind of time frames, a DC rapid charging motorcycle is the only viable option. Any bike reliant on AC charging and lacking DC rapid charging or active cooling would be incapable of such a trip in the same time frame. This doesn't mean that any one particular electric motorbike is better than another. Riders should consider their real-world riding habits. If they only ever cover up to 100 miles or 160 kilometres a day, or go further afield but have 90 or so minutes for a break where they can charge, Zero and other manufacturers offer a range of bikes which will meet those demands. But that's not good enough for the occasional 300 plus mile or 500 kilometre or further journey, especially when that journey includes motorways, freeways, Autobahnen, Autoroute, Autostrade, or whatever you want to call them, to reach a destination. To my mind, given the clear demands, and based on what is now personal experience, Energica produce bikes which will meet the needs of those who wish to tour, and in that respect they're currently very much light on competition. This fact hasn't gone unnoticed by those of us who have been asking for DC charging capable motorcycles for many years, and some of the longer term electric riders are now voting with their wallets. It's time for Energica's competition to buck up their ideas. In the UK at least, the sale of new petrol motorbikes will be forbidden in 2035. Other markets will be making similar decisions. It's time for the other manufacturers, even existing electric motorbike manufacturers, to play catch up or to fall behind. Energica has already come a long way in a relatively short time, and that's a crucial advantage in EV world. And with that thought, a big thanks goes out to Alec, Andrea and team at Energica UK and English Electric Motor Company for their support and for the loan of the bike, or bikes. It was much appreciated. Thanks for watching and see you again soon.